Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Political Incorrectors podcast. My name is Luke.
My name is Eric.
We're delighted to be back, obviously, and today we're very happy to have a special guest to interview on the podcast, and that is none other than Art O'Mahony, a good friend of mine through the ISSU and through my involvement in Young Fine Gael and Fine Gael. And Art is currently the president of Young Fine Gael, so a big shot on the podcast, probably the biggest fish we've had yet, Art. He's also a public affairs executive in the private sector. He's 23 from Kerry, obviously a great county in Ireland. And he's also a musician, so he's a multi-talented individual in all sorts of spheres of life and of influence. So Art, we're delighted to have you on.
No, absolutely delighted to be on. I think it's probably the first time and the last time I'll ever be called a big shot or multi-talented. So I'm in bonus territory before we ever start.
And Art, before we get into anything juicy and political, what musical instrument do you actually play?
I am one of these kind of quintessential amateur musicians that for a very long time in my life traded off playing Wonderwall on the guitar, but I do play the guitar for my sins, and for most of my time in college I would have played in bars every Friday, Saturday, Sunday evening. So nothing incredibly interesting. There are members of my national executive who are far more musical than me. I've somehow managed to enjoy the credentials of being the resident musician, but I think that's being very generous to me.
Okay, well, I never met it past like the basic tenets of tin whistle, so anyone who's done anything more, I appreciate. I have to ask you though, to get into it, of course, you're the president of YFG, and of course we're all young people too, and our podcast is about young people in politics and breaking down the barriers to talking politics for young people. One of the, I think, questions that faces a lot of young people in politics is, what party do I join? There's many parties out there, many of them share different values. There's lots of talk of compromising your values to some extent when it comes to joining a party. So you had a multiplicity of different options in the Irish political system. Why did you choose YFG and Fine Gael?
Yeah, well, I mean, in truth, I give you a really philosophical or ideological answer. The honest truth is I actually arrived in YFG by accident almost. My introduction to politics was very much a massive interest in youth activism, an interest in, as a student, trying to, I guess, vocalize and articulate concerns of classmates and try to influence decision making within my own school. I was involved in setting up a student council in my boys' secondary school and served as chair for 2 or 3 years. And my real vehicle and introduction into wider politics was one day in the letterbox into the school came this very shiny blue envelope. Now, anybody who's been involved in ISSU might have known what these envelopes are. I didn't have any idea what they were, but basically it was an invitation for the chair of the student council to go to the ISSU annual assembly, which was taking place in Liberty Hall. And you know, I'm sure lots of teenagers have lots of exciting plans and ideas for what they do over the course of the Easter holidays. Evidently, I didn't have a whole pile of plans, or at least if I did, was more than well prepared to substitute them for heading up to this thing. That was back in, I think, I'd say probably April 2015, I think. I put my name forward for a role that I think has now changed. The role is Campaigns and Communications Officer. So my introduction to politics really was getting involved in the Irish Second Level Student Union. I was elected that day by total chance. I really was an amateur to politics. I did not bring any friends or any classmates or anything to the event. By pure whim, I'd say I managed to talk to enough people in the interval that lasted like 45 minutes and convinced them that I was good enough to do the job for a year. And amidst that interval, an outgoing person who was involved, the vice president of the ISSU at the time, was a guy called Declan Burgess. And he had basically said, oh, I've seen you've liked a few of our Facebook posts. I've seen you've been mildly involved, you know, in maybe Twitter or whatever else, but not really in any meaningful capacity. Would you be interested in coming along to this event? And that's actually how I got involved. From, I guess, I would have been reasonably sympathetic to the to the party and to the youth organization, but I knew very little about youth politics. My dad is traditionally a big Fianna Fáil voter, and all up the line would have been Fianna Fáil people. My mom, not that political, to be honest. No reason one way or the other to get involved in politics, just barren interest, and I guess that's where it started. And I know Declan is now a councillor and potentially a future TD, but it's just funny the way things go. But yeah, I could give you something a lot more inspiring, but it would be untrue. The reality is I happened to meet somebody in the toilets who convinced me that YFG was the right organization to join, and 7 or 8 years later, here I am running the thing.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think I actually forgot to mention at the start, I think that I met Art through ISU, and I was on the exec in ISU. I was education officer my first term. Similarly, like Art, I somehow got elected at annual assembly, and Art was international officer that term. So that's how I met Art, and I suppose Art probably influenced me in a way to get involved in YFG. So these things are kind of cyclical, right? It's funny, and the story about Declan's interesting as well, because obviously he's a big profile now for himself as a councillor, which is mad to think. Like a few years ago, we knew him as an issue person, and obviously Eric as well kind of got involved in kind of activism, student politics through ISU as well. So it's a great organization. I think it doesn't get the credit it deserves in kind of encouraging people to get involved in politics and civics in Ireland. But to get more into the politics of it, Art, and this is a tricky question, I suppose, especially based on your answer to that last question, and it's about political identity and your ideology. And I guess Ireland's a funny place when it comes to politics, because for the past 80 years, it hasn't really come into the equation. But with the introduction of Sinn Féin as a major player in politics, I think it's starting to shape up a bit ideologically. And my question to you is, where would you place yourself on the political spectrum? Would you say you're right of centre, left of centre, maybe a little bit out towards, or more in the centre? How would you describe your political ideology and philosophy?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Luke. And to be honest, I think sometimes the kind of ideological polarization of politics, which is, receives a hell of a lot of attention in the media of late, I think sometimes it's overstated in Ireland. Candidly, I think that in truth, Sinn Féin's rise in popularity as well, look, in part aspects of their policy adventures have been somewhat populist in that they've stayed out of questions around climate action and a number of other things. But the truth is that they have nuanced a lot of their positions and moved towards a more centre-left demeanour. And I guess the same is true for a lot of the major political parties in Ireland. In terms of my own kind of viewpoint, I guess if I was to pick myself on a map, I would probably say I am one of these traditionally centre-right individuals. But I'm of a view that politics is moved past this kind of nature of asking where do you identify on a map. I don't necessarily think it's actually that helpful. I think politics at its very best is very issue-centred, and I think that people who have become politically mobilized over the last number of years, and I think we're seeing a level of youth activism in politics that is unrivaled in the history of the state. It's largely centered around people wanting to resolve individual issues. And I'm not necessarily convinced that a person whose gateway into politics, whether that is wanting to reform the Leaving Cert, or whether they wish to campaign against the injustice that is Ireland's housing situation, or whether they want to receive better treatment for healthcare workers, or a plethora of different issues, whether I guess going down the direct avenue of putting them into an ideological underpinning that's useful. And I guess, candidly speaking, as president of a youth wing that is quite, I would say, a broad church of people who are, well, I would hope, warm to varying different views, I don't think it's that useful to start immediately talking about ideology either. But I guess my own standpoint would be, I am as an individual involved in politics, I am in love with the idea of advancing evidence-based policy. That would be, if I was to define myself more than anything else, I'm inherently suspicious of grand ideas that have absolutely no underpinning or basis in any proof, any comparative analysis, anything of the sort. And that's not to say that I am an idealist. I certainly am. But my politics, I would say, is to a large extent, I guess, cautious, which sounds extremely boring. And I'm sure this is the point where people are going to start logging off and be like, right, that's enough of Arto Mahoney. But I hope it gives you a general insight into where my thought process lies.
No, it absolutely does. And it's actually interesting that you identify in that way politically, because in our last episode, Luke and I talked about something that we hope to bring up with you later on, the culture war. What we saw as the remedy to the culture war was an empirical politics that actually looked at evidence, and rather than an overzealous, ideological, what we see in the culture wars where it's all about the camp you're in and the like, and it's really tribalistic. We felt like the remedy to that was one that was focused on evidence, the politics focused on evidence. So it's interesting to hear you say that. And of course, it is boring, especially in today's day and age, when there is a very strong, I think, gravitational pull by ideology. And I think, when it comes to Fine Gael, from an outsider's perspective and YFG, we've seen headlines, lots of headlines in the news that over the past, let's say, couple of years of how, as you said, the youth party, is a broad church. There are people within the party, so it seems from my perspective, who, like you, would be for rational, commonsensical politics, and others who would be attracted to ideology. And I find, and Luke and I had a conversation about this a couple of months ago, when people talk about like ideological infancy, or like really kind of silly, unsubstantiated, kind of hyper ideological thinking, it's often associated with the radical left, and understandably so. But I think a similar strain can exist on the radical right. And I'm not talking about the alt-right or anything, but a form of politics that is over-obsessed with the items of the right, like the marketplace and the like, just for the sake of it. Nothing to do with what a recent study said about the economy. Everything to do with the fact that the beautiful word, the market, was in it. Like, let's say on the other side, it might be the state or something like that. And within YFG, it seems like that broad church encompasses that kind of ideological infantilism, from what I've seen from the headlines, but also a more common sense approach. So what do you say to this, like the YAF event that a YFG member attended and that got lots of headlines? Do you feel it's misrepresenting the actual substance of YFG? Or do you feel like there's an element of that in the party, and maybe it's inevitable in youth politics?
I think there are a number of things I would say to that, and I certainly agree with the kind of the analysis and summary that you've just given, Eric. Admittedly, evidence-based policy and evidence-based politics, which is something I know that is a topic that both of you have had the chance to discuss at great length in recent episodes, is number one, not the sexiest form of politics, but is also not the kind of politics that generally tends to get headlines. The truth is, we are meeting as a youth organization with Pascal Donoghue in 2 weeks' time. We are talking about increasing funding for carers. We're talking about increasing, I guess, how we increasing the betterment of how we treat our healthcare staff. There are a lot of nuanced proposals that go in. We have people within YFG who work in disability services, who work in education, who work in an absolute swathe of different sectors. And some of the ideas that we put forward, in my view, are unrivaled in terms of both their quality, but their capacity to actually be implemented. None of those ever receive headlines, unfortunately, and that is the sad truth. As much as we try, and I think, and this isn't being YFG specific. I think youth politics, 90% of the time, whether that is Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, the Labour Party, Social Democrats, the Greens, the vast quantity of the work that goes on is incredibly inspiring. It aims to it aims to use politics as an avenue for getting good ideas across, and also being a place where you can meet friends and everything else. That's not really interesting if you're reading the Journal, or if you're reading the Independent, or if you're reading whatever else and want to find out about YFG or Ogre Fianna Fáil or whatever else. And the truth is, what does get magnified are the things that might necessarily be as desirable. And the truth is, in politics, particularly in youth politics, you are going to have people who have varying views, who have diverging views, and have extreme views. And if I'm being honest, as someone who's 23, going on 24 later on this year, me at 16 isn't me at 23. And I'm not entirely sure, would I or would lots of people like me have stayed in youth politics or have been attracted to go into politics. And I actually look at people who went through youth politics, not just in Fine Gael, but in other parties, whether that is in the case of our own party, Leo Varadkar, Simon Harris, lots more besides Fianna Fáil. I'm sure they have Jack Chambers, Lisa Chambers, and loads more. Would they have managed to have a successful career had they been judged by what they did at 16 or 17? I'm not really sure. And my concern is, and this is the difficulty of being chair of a youth wing, is while you mightn't necessarily agree with some of the views espoused by some members, it is important to make sure that we don't, I guess, apply an element of hegemony to our politics, whereby you lock out people from having the chance to learn more about politics, to influence policy and actually maybe change their mind. I know I have. And I think if I was in another youth political organization, I mightn't have had the chance to change my mind on lots of different things. I know I wouldn't have had the chance to articulate views against the popular narrative of the senior party. And I guess one thing I would say to listeners is that YFG always has and always will be an organization that wants to debate big issues, hear a voice that isn't otherwise heard, and try to advance, a narrative that we can all agree with, that is in the best interest of the country.
Yeah, I think you raised some really interesting points there. And actually, I just listened to a podcast, Alan Kinsella's podcast on the others, like the smaller parties start political history. I just listened to one on militant Labour, and it's really interesting because on kind of the other side of politics, I heard him talking about Michael D. Higgins defending, the kind of Trotskyists that were in the Labour youth at the time. And it was just an interesting listen. I think his point of view kind of echoes a lot of what you've said. There definitely is a place, and, YFG is a broad church. I do wonder if there's a line, and whether there's people who can be too zealous in their ideology, especially thinking of the kind of American right-wing politics that's kind of crept into the party, but like that is a minority. And I do really get your point on not trying to essentially cancel young people who are involved in politics at a young age because they might have gone down a particular path at the early stage of their political development. And I think you made a good point. Like, and I'd say the same myself as someone who got involved in politics at, like, let's say 15, 16. Ideologically, or philosophically, I'm a completely different person today than I was then. And I think you raise a good point. I wonder what you think about that, though. Like, is there a line? Is there people who might be a bit too extreme and zealous in their ideology? What do you think about that?
I think there is a line. I mean, to be honest, I'm accused of many things as a young person involved in politics, but failing to speak my mind is rarely one. And I'll be truthful. I think it is abhorrent that anybody who shares the value system of a political party that will defend probably the most extreme gun rights you could possibly imagine in the wake of mass shootings across the United States. I personally see that as being completely incompatible with the value system which I would share, and which I believe is the value system of both my youth wing and of the party which I'm involved in. And I guess one thing I would say is my underlying philosophy, and this was the original question, and to be honest, I fudged it a little bit. But my I guess if I was to articulate it truly, is that I believe that Fine Gael is probably the closest political organization to that which will defend a lot of the institutions of society which are very often taken for granted, and is willing to defend what ought to be conserved. And I think a lot of people who trade in American right-wing politics describe themselves as conservatives. And the question I would very often ask them is, well, what actually are you trying to conserve? Most of these people tend to have no interest in defending the institutions of the state. Most of them have very little interest in defending aspects of free trade. the independence of the judiciary, in an inherently conservative principle, which is free speech and which is respecting those who have differing views to you. And my fear really in politics is, and I hope it isn't something that is going to happen, and I did say I think this is somewhat exaggerated in the Irish political context, or at least I hope that it won't worsen, is that that you do immediately find a camp for yourself, and it actually doesn't matter whether or not you you meet the acid test of being in that camp. We have conservatives who aren't conservative. We have liberals who aren't liberal, and that is the way we find ourselves in our modern politics. It's a huge problem. In fact, it's probably one of the biggest problems that we're going to face over the next few years. And it's a very, very fair question, Luke. I mean, from my perspective, should I be defending, or should YFG be defending, or should Ógra Fianna Fáil, or should Ógra Sinn Féin be defending the extreme ends? I don't know. I personally, I believe the best way of advancing a meaningful type of youth politics is inspire from the top. And for the most part, the work that we do, and if anybody is listening and is interested in getting involved, the truth is the work that YFG does is trying to influence policy that really actually matters to people. And I'm not that interested in wasting time on culture war or whatever else. And I think a lot of people who complain about culture war on the right or on the left are actually the people who politically profiteer most from it.
Yeah, I think you raised that a really balanced answer, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, and raised some really interesting questions about whether that kind of political positioning is actually conservative. That was a great point. Just kind of briefly on YFG before we move on to the kind of the senior party and the future of the party. YFG in the future, do you see, what role do you think YFG will play in the future of Irish politics? And do you see right now in YFG a kind of promising political cohort of people like, let's say, YFG of Leo Varadkar and Simon Harris's days in the junior branch? Do you see a promising group of people there who can take the reins in a few years' time?
I'm going to answer the second question first and the first question second. The second question on do I see talent and do I see an inspiring future for politics that's coming out of YFG? In short, absolutely. I admittedly have never experienced the level of talent, ideas, sincerity, and ambition, enthusiasm about politics over the course of my time at YFG. We've had a number of big events over the last few months, and what's really humbling and also really reassuring for me as somebody who's been involved for the bones of 8 years is that when I'm finishing up, because I can't be around forever either, that there is a bright future for the organization. And what's particularly inspiring for me, and a legacy which I would love to leave, is that there are an awful lot of people who are becoming involved in the organization who, in my view, wouldn't have traditionally become involved. I think politics has historically been largely male, largely pale, and to be honest, I've described myself at some point, a journalist described me as male, pale, and stale. But the truth is, we are seeing more involvement from women. We're seeing more involvement from people from backgrounds who otherwise wouldn't have gotten involved in politics. We are seeing an element of autonomy and drive among facets of our organization, like our second level network, that weren't, I guess, weren't structured and weren't advanced when I first got involved. And we certainly had a really, really thriving organization when I first got involved, and we still do. But I would be very confident that there is a future, a strong future for the YFG alumni in I guess in politics widely and in Fine Gael itself. And forgive me, Luke, what was the first question? The first question was,
it was kind of like, what role do you think YFG can play in the future of Irish politics, which I suppose is kind of related to the second.
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, you have to go back to first principles. So for context for people who are listening this evening, or whatever point in the day they're tuning into this podcast, YFG was established after Fine Gael was annihilated in the 1977 general election, and a very young, innovative and brave leader, Gareth Fitzgerald, decided that we should have a youth wing, but we should also have a youth wing that is entitled to autonomy. It is something that the Labour Party, Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, none of which offered to their youth wings until about 3 decades afterwards. And the truth is, the best of our youth organisation was generally when we were giving a dissenting voice. That is particularly difficult when you're in government. And over the course of YFG's existence from 1977 onwards, Fine Gael was never in government for probably more than 4 years. And in the last 11, 12 years, and for the next 3 or 4 years, we are in government. So invariably, being a youth wing has become a little bit more difficult because it's a lot harder to criticize your own party. My view is that the future of YFG is not to become another hegemonic leg of the Fine Gael party. And I think any attempt to make it such should be resisted wholly. I think in the long term, YFG's autonomy has very often proven to be has proven to articulate points and hold views that ultimately appeared to be the right ones. We were a champion of extremely progressive causes in the 1980s, in the 1990s, right throughout our time. We were the party who advanced the stronger European integration narrative well before it was ever being pushed by any major political party. And for me, YFG's future in the wider political discourse needs to be the Fine Gael 45 years ago. And I think at times we fail to do that. And maybe if I put my hands up, at times maybe I have failed to challenge aspects of Fine Gael policy that I felt uncomfortable with. But I think the future for YFG, if we're not an honest broker in the representative of young people.
Those are fantastic points there, really interesting points. And I certainly can't wait to see how YFG and other youth parties evolve, particularly considering the issue with ideology, which is something that we're going to touch on again later on, that seems to be pervading political discourse at the moment with the influence of the culture war and the internet and the like. But yeah, really interesting answer. And of course, I think resorting back to the popular perception of not only YFG, but the senior party that can sometimes be found scattered across media discourse and intellectual and political discourse, but also popular discourse about the party. There's, I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of pejorative image of Fine Gael as the bourgeoisie party that represents the elite within society, often referred to in the context of the FFG syndicate, as I joke about when I talk with Luke about particular media stories about this, or comments from popular figures, let's say, in Irish life. Why do you think this depiction of the party has been put out there by many people, and not only from political dissenters or political rivals, let's say like Sinn Féin, who I think has engaged in a grueling cultural war with Fine Gael over the past while, but from popular kind of sources, from members of the public? Why do you think this depiction sticks to the party and seems to be something that the party has met with time and again, when they're faced with people who might disagree with the politics of the senior party, or people who might not be that informed about politics, but have seen this narrative or this depiction be promoted by particular sources?
I think it's a fascinating question. I would begin by saying that depiction was never one that I ever associated with Fine Gael. To give some background from my own perspective, neither of my parents went to college. My dad ran a very small business in a small town. My mom looked after 3 of us. We went to university because we could access the Susie Grant program. We all worked part-time over the course of our time in college. And for the most part, I would say the ordinary Fine Gael voter, or ordinary citizen in society. And some of the people that have inspired me most in Fine Gael, in YFG and in other circles, are people who have come from backgrounds completely and utterly at odds with the caricature which is very often put out against the party. I think of somebody who unfortunately only served one term in the Dáil, and I hope might at some point return, is Noel Rock, a teacher who grew up in the Ballymun Flats, who rose within the ranks of the party and within his own community, and as a national politician who came through YFG, was incredible in his own right and has gone on to do incredible things in the aftermath of politics. I think there is sometimes a lazy narrative that goes out about politics that certain political parties are vested interests into certain elements of society, and as such that they are the only aspects of society which they care about. It's not a perception which I've ever recognized, and candidly is not one that I would ever try to pin against another political party. I fundamentally believe Sinn Féin is not necessarily a working class driven party. Some people consider that criticism, but the truth is that their membership has, similarly to the Labour Party, the Social Democrats, spans across aspects of different Irish society. And I think the reason that we found ourselves in this place where we have this conversation about left versus right is that it's a comfortable baseline to begin political analysis. And there are a number of different things that there are a number of different reasons why that's useful for journalism and for media. First of all, there's an element of consistency, and you can rationalize the irrational nature of electoral politics, and that is something I think that's understated. And I guess one point I think that was made to me very recently by a senior politician, Gael, which I thought was just a clever point that I've never really heard in the media, is there's very, very little recognition of the role of luck in politics. And it's a fascinating point, I think. People don't like luck because luck is unpredictable. Luck is something that you can't necessarily wager against or put an insurance policy out against. Someone might happen to withdraw from a constituency 3 months out from a general election who had the safest seat in the country. And I guess what I find interesting is I think that our politics has encouraged this narrative that we can rationalize a 1% rise in one particular poll or a 1% fall and say it's because of this, where the truth is that it could be because of something entirely different. But not to completely ramble on this particular point, but to finish, I would say I think that the attempt to try to class wars and to pin political parties against each other based on socioeconomic backgrounds or based on ideological dispositions, social issues, I mean, I think it lacks an element of nuance, and I think in reality it's not reflective of what the wider public actually think when it comes to a lot of these political parties.
Interesting, Art. And something that you said, something that actually I think ran across what you said there, is something that Luke and I have said time and again to ourselves, interestingly, about Irish politics. I think I got this just from you. If I didn't, you can correct me. For the most part, it seems to be a service-driven game, where you can find who are working in the local constituency, and ideology doesn't seem to be the first thing that pops to the mind of the average Irish voter when it comes to voting for a political party. And therefore, a lot of commentary on politics, I think, particularly from people who are more intellectual with their commentary, it's almost like you have to have an ideological framework and therefore have to have a hero, have to have a villain, and have to sort of squeeze parties within the particular boxes, even if that kind of overlooks the nuances of the political landscape within the country. So that seems to be something that is very true. But a follow-up question that I have for you is, and I know you sort of answered this question, but considering the issue around, the broad church problem that all youth parties will face and all political parties will face, do you feel, and some comments from particular politicians within Fine Gael, so Leo Varadkar, for example, stuff that he said in the past about, well, for that tweet that he put up 2 years ago, where he said something about Sinn Féin being a party that isn't concerned for straight white males. do you feel the party has like made mistakes that substantiate that depiction to some extent? And do you feel that is inaccurate, the substantiation, or do you feel that it speaks to an element within the party that actually lives that depiction, even if it's only a small one?
It's a great question. The short answer is yes, and I could give one example which has received much attention already, but I think it would be remiss of me not to mention. I centrally involved, and my youth organization was centrally involved in the last by-election last June in Dublin Bay South, and the last day of the night before the by-election vote, a tweet went out which spoke about aspects of the constituency, Ringsend and Irishtown, and effectively said that the Sinn Féin vote was out in droves. There were a number of problems with that tweet. First and foremost, it assumed that, I think, aspects of a constituency, or aspects of, I guess, what would, there are 40 constituencies in Ireland, that there are certain parts of constituencies that will never vote Fine Gael. We had no evidence whatsoever to say that. The second point was that we were kind of happy to go along and advance that point. That tweet made me particularly uncomfortable. I think it made a lot of members uncomfortable, and it actually infuriated an awful lot of us, because it in many ways confirmed a narrative that was being advanced by opposing parties towards my own, which is that there is an element of disinterest towards working class communities, that there is an element of disinterest towards parts of constituencies. And that is something that I have, in my experience in politics, have believe that is wholly untrue. I don't think I would have stayed involved in Fine Gael had I felt that our public representatives didn't care about the communities which they served. So, in part, I think there is an element of responsibility which the party must take ownership over, in terms of its failure to advance a narrative that shows that our constituency is the country. I think that's something Tony Blair said at some point towards the end of his time as Prime Minister, that our core vote is not the North, is not the South, is not London, but it's the country. And I think that should always be the point of view for any major political party in Ireland. But I would caveat that a small bit. There is another aspect that says that, the points which we have made in terms of some of our policy endeavours, that they are in some way disenfranchising of aspects of Irish society. That I don't entirely agree with. And I think one aspect of our politics which is concerning in my view is that there seems to be a social monopoly on aspects of our politics. And a good example is the National Women's Council earlier on this week effectively saying that it was anti-women to reduce income tax. Now, in my personal view, I think that goes over and beyond what an NGO funded by the state could go along and say. I firmly believe that actually trusting people to spend their own money, that being cautious in terms of public expenditure, and actually ensuring that there is an economy to grow before that there is wealth to redistribute. These are things that any government should be taking seriously. So I am reserved to say that things that the party leader has said are in some way anti-working class or anti-aspects of the Fine Gael voter. I think that's actually unfair. And in fact, in truth, I think where we have fallen down as a party is that we could be accused of doing a lot of kite flying. So we talk about a lot of policy endeavours that we might possibly do that, in my view, could benefit huge aspects of Irish society that very rarely end up getting implemented. And you fall between two stools then, because you're accused of representing one demographic by talking about issues that you don't necessarily pursue, while another aspect of the electorate is frustrated that you're not fulfilling the promises that you said you would. So that would be my thinking on the question. And if I've missed any of it, Eric, or if I've completely gone down a total rabbit hole, pull me back, please.
Happy with the answers, Ayrton. Happy with the answers.
Yeah, I think you definitely got to the essence of Eric's question anyway, and I think it's good to see you call out the the crime scene tape post from the Dublin Very South by-election. I think it's something we spoke about on this podcast, and certainly Gareth, we spoke about it. Just wasn't a good look. I don't think it was ever a good look. And it was good to see at the time people within the senior party, even I know Regina Doherty kind of strongly called it out, and other people in the parliamentary party even. So it wasn't a kind of like a whole scale party decision to put it out there, but it was a wrong decision. And it was good to see you call that out. But you do make interesting points then about the National Women's Council, for example. And we did cover similar stuff about the National Women's Council on a previous episode with Jane Butler and Isabel Flanagan. We touched on kind of the politicisation of the National Women's Council. And it could be a conversation we have again. But to stick with Fine Gael before we move on into some other political points, and it's a bit of a tabloidy kind of independent.ie question. But Leo Varadkar, right, leader of Fine Gael, who knows how long he'll be leader of Fine Gael. But let's say, whenever it may be, Leo Varadkar is gone, he resigns, he stands down, he retires. Who would you like to see as the next leader of Fine Gael, and why?
I think as president of Young Fine Gael, you'll forgive me for not giving one specific answer to this. But what I would say is, I think if I was to give my candid analysis of where the leadership race, where I want to rise be at the moment, I think our Justice Minister Helen McEntee has been exceptional in terms of the way she has I guess the way in which she has identified policy and advanced ideas that, in my view, are probably close enough to, I guess, the zeitgeist of public opinion. And I think there are a number of other Fine Gael politicians besides, but to start with Helen, she has managed to, I guess, as a politician, enjoy a status in a very difficult department whereby people who aren't that interested in politics will say, oh, I like Helen, or I actually can point to a specific thing that is being done in said department. And to be honest, most of my friends aren't very party political, so I generally use the temperature check as hearing what people think of where we are. And, you know, sometimes it's quite critical, and that's fair enough as well. But I think there is a star attached to her name that you would have to watch out for. And I also think the nature of our political landscape is that we will see far more female leaders of political parties going into the future. And I think Fine Gael would be wise after probably 14 male leaders, one after the other. And if you look at some of our stats in terms of our voter attraction, potentially making, you know, being wise enough to pick somebody who's very reflective of a huge aspect of society might be a clever thing to do. Naturally, Simon Harris is another clear front runner in the race. Has been very, very helpful in the context of his work with YFG. I think on the whole has been very impressive as a Minister for Further and Higher Education. In terms of other runners and riders, there are a few other names that I think that never get spoken about, which I find interesting, because I think actually there might be a few people in the in-betweens that, depending on when the vacancy arises, could be in a very, very comfortable position. And one example I would give is your local TD, Luke, Peter Burke. I think that Peter has been an extremely impressive junior minister, is extraordinarily liked right across the Fine Gael parliamentary party, which is something that very few politicians can claim to be. Is a young politician who isn't necessarily associated with anything untoward or anything that has been negative over the course of the last few general elections which the party has faced. And in my view, were there to be a leadership vacancy in 2 years' time, I actually think I might invite people to go back and listen to this podcast and say that I mentioned him as a potential leadership candidate. But it's an interesting one. Now, I don't see a leadership vacancy arising before the next general election. I think the Taoiseach will become the Taoiseach, and I think we will face the next general election. I think the next general election will be a huge struggle for Fine Gael, and I at this moment in time find it difficult to see our path back to government. And depending on the result, I'm not entirely sure that I would be falling over myself to find a path back to government. But that would be my thoughts on the Fine Gael leadership election. But I think there'll be a leadership election in our at least one of our sister parties in coalition, if not both, before that.
Expertly managed swerve of the question, but great analysis in place. Really good analysis, Art. I agree 100%. And Peter will be absolutely delighted to hear that, I know. And a good point, definitely one to watch. Really good point. He's a great fella, and I'd hopefully have him on the podcast sooner. We can ask him some questions and maybe ask him explicitly. And you can take some tips from Art Mahoney on swerving the hard question.
There we go. He might appoint me as a special advisor if he does become Taoiseach.
Yeah, well, just to segue out of the segment we're currently on with regard to the senior party, and on just to something that we've touched on now and again in our conversation, the culture war and ideology. Again, another subject that Luke and I have talked vociferously about in recent times. It seems like the culture war, of course, it's a multifaceted issue, but one of the major components of it is ideology. And you could see an unhealthy relationship to ideology and over-reliance on ideology, so much so that it kind of, overlooks the reality that's on the ground. And it seems like because of the technological influence of the influence, its connectivity, and also the sexiness of politics in America and the UK, which would be antithetical to the type of politics that you said you advocate for, Art, which is evidence-based and, as you described, more boring, but in the right type of way, I would say, in terms of how you put it. And it seems like here in Ireland, an element of culture war politics and hyper-ideological politics is creeping in. And naturally, and I don't say this in a condescending way, because I'm by no means immunized from this when it comes to younger people, because of how connected we are to political discourse through the internet and to what's going on overseas through the internet too. And I think it's inevitable that this will change the dynamics of Irish politics. I think that's something that you can't necessarily avoid. It seems like a tide that's going to be hard to move by. And in the UK, we've seen recently, when it comes to new media and also traditional media, Talk TV, GB News, it seems like the kind of Fox News, super ideological creep into electoral politics is really happening. In the recent Tory leadership election, I remember watching interviews for a couple of the leaders, particularly Jeremy Hunt's, and I think it was Sophie Ridge on Sky News who asked, "What is a woman?" Like, they were talking about really serious things, and in the entirety of the interview, they didn't even mention the Northern Ireland Protocol. A lot of serious issues that you think you'd ask the prospective Prime Minister. Instead, it was, "What is a woman?" And that was asked to many other Tory leadership contestants, hopefuls also. So the culture war stuff is really creeping into electoral politics too, which is scary in this side of the world. So do you see that happening here in Ireland? Do you notice a creep in Ireland, and do you see it going that way in the future? And I guess to put a hopeful cap on the questions I've put to you, is there a way out for us here in Ireland, or is it just an inevitability that we have to be prepared for?
I think with a question like that, it's very important that the three of us remind ourselves that as upstanding, and I can only speak for the two of you, I can't speak for myself, but as enthusiastic and as ideas driven and as concerned as we are about these issues, the fascination which we have with politics and our inhabitants of social media platforms like Twitter, that's not representative of society at large. It's not actually overly representative of even young people. And my fear is with this issue is that we misplace the fury and the concern of Twitter with the fury and frustration of the public. And I actually think, and this actually is probably contradictory to what a lot of people in the media would say, I think Sinn Féin's success has nothing to do with its ability to necessarily be the vehicle for frustration on Twitter. I think they're good at that as well, but I think they actually are a lot wiser than Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or the Green Party or even the Labour Party or any others in realizing that most people aren't on Twitter, and that actually every now and then you can take a populist line on something that you'll be bashed on Twitter for, but that the wider public mightn't take much notice on. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing, of course, but when it comes to the polarization of politics, I think Ireland is better positioned in that I think our media landscape is a lot more is a lot less partisan, is a lot more nuanced, and for the most part, it's quite fair. And don't get me wrong, political parties, people like me, every so often will get a hatchet job article from a particular platform. It shouldn't discredit the entire platform. I think most of our journalists, the vast majority of our journalists, and the vast majority of the media landscape in Ireland is inherently well driven. It is guided by holding power to account, not just the government but opposition as well. Whether that's Eva Grace Moore holding Fine Gael to account or Philip Ryan holding Sinn Féin to account, they all serve their own purpose one way or the other, and they will get criticised heavily for it. And I think in order to prevent a wider polarization of our society, and in order to prevent that kind of populist tendency from, I guess, infecting our politics, it is really, really important that we defend the media landscape, because I think the true enabler of Trump, Brexit, whatever else you want to pick, has been a media landscape that has endorsed it. And I don't think we are in a place really where the Irish Independent, the Irish Times, News Talk, whoever else, the main means in which people receive their news at the moment, are going that way. I'm not actually convinced that we are, and I've said this a few times over the course of the podcast, that we are destined to be a left-right divided society. I don't think it's going to be like that. And I think Sinn Féin haven't actually enjoyed the rise in their popularity because of adopting an incredibly far-left populist line. I think they have probably used populist lines that every opposition party has ever used of holding governments to account. But I'm not convinced they won't, as a government, adopt a more nuanced position and hold pilot their policies, and that's going to be difficult for them as well. And you can already see that they have moderated in lots of their policy and a lot of their language over the last few years. So in truth, I would hope that the cycle that we're experiencing at the moment is just as cyclical as politics is, that it's not something entirely new, that it's not something that we're wholly unprepared for. I think young people have always been a lot more ideological, have always been more, I guess, susceptible to enjoying popular trends in politics. It's not a bad thing necessarily. The student union movement was a lot more powerful in the 80s than it is now. You'll find that the Irish state was probably founded by people mainly in their 20s and 30s, and that element of idealism and that element of frustration and a belief that politics should be an avenue for change, that is a fashion that I don't think will ever be undone. So it's probably a peculiarly positive answer to, I think, was probably a loaded negative question. So maybe I'm completely wrong. I hope I'm right, and I hope that the tradition of Irish politics being a relatively moderate system of government, that continues.
I hope you're right too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I hope you're right too. Obviously, I think we spoke about the similar kind of thing on our last episode. I think we kind of said that the next election will be a defining point, and I think it will either be like that kind of Fianna Fáil moment back in 1932 when it could have been the Reds under the bed, but it turned out to be they gradually found themselves to the centre. So Sinn Féin could either do that, or they could go crazy and be that populist left-wing party in government, which I think is unlikely, like you said, even given their current policy. They have moderated, and I think they're scared nearly to even defend some of the kind of left populist policies on the airwaves and in political discourse. So good points there, and that optimism is definitely needed, I think, in discourse art. But to move on from that and on to another issue we spoke about last week on our podcast was the chaos in the Áras. So Sabina Higgins got herself and Michael D into a bit of trouble when she wrote a letter to the Irish Times. And we spoke about this. I think I roundly criticised it, and I think Eric also criticised it quite fairly. But one thing we did note on that episode was, I think, and I hope I haven't got this wrong, your call for Michael D. Higgins to resign over this issue. You weren't happy at all. So what is your position on it, on that whole fiasco? And did you call for Michael D. Higgins to resign over it? And does that call still stand?
So what I said was I believe that Michael D. Higgins should consider his position. Now, whether you believe that's a call for resignation or not is up to other people. My view on this, I guess, and it was well articulated in your last podcast, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I wholly agreed with all the points that were put forward. I guess when it comes to this entire fiasco, and I would call it a fiasco, there is a risk that this sort of thing becomes the norm. And you did touch on this at the end, and there's no point for the interest of listeners of going through the ins and outs of the letter and whether the letter was ill-advised or not. I think most people at this point are familiar with the contents of the letter. My concern is and remains that the office of president and what we always would have thought the role of the office of president would be might possibly change in the coming years. And something which was spoken about in the last podcast was whether the final few years of the Higgins presidency might mean that we'll get less of this or more of this. And my firm belief is we probably will get more of this. And I think it's important, even if you agree with Michael D. Higgins, or even if you agree with the spouse of Michael D. Higgins, or with or with whatever else, is that, and this is something that I was always taught in law, was that achieving the right outcome is one thing, but how you get there is the important part. And if you agree with the sentiment, that's okay. That is, I mean, I will disagree with that, but I think it's a fair point. But the means by which you get to that narrative, that's the point that we need to look at, because that's the constitutional question. And Luke, you touched on at the last episode, we could have had a very different president. The next president of Ireland could be very different. And my concern would be that if we believe, because the sentiment or the activity is something which is okayed effectively by a considerable element of our politics, that we're going to allow for that to become a normal feature of our politics. And I think that is a very concerning revelation if that does happen. And I think from a constitutional point of view, I find it very uncomfortable, or I find it frustrating that a republic of all forms of government seem to get more upset or more outraged by the means of holding the head of state to account. It's funny, like in monarchs, such as the UK, the media probably spend a disproportionate amount of time commentating on people, whereas in Ireland, a democracy which was founded by the people, that ultimately the ultimate power lies with the people, that whenever somebody questions, for instance, this weekend, Michael D. Higgins spending €8,000 on flying from Kerry to Clare, then anytime something like that happens, that there is a question of the motives of the people who question said president. And I think it's a point that will need to be discussed more widely as we move into the rest of this term, and as we move into who the next president of Ireland is. And it isn't by any means a personal criticism of Michael D. Higgins. Or I mean, lots of us have met Michael D. Higgins. I probably would say he's one of the most decent, funny, intellectual kind of people you could find, and in many ways, is the epitome of the kind of person that you believe should be a figurehead of the state, and that's okay. I mean, I'm not here to suggest that Michael D. Higgins, his predecessor or successors, are going to be the devil incarnate or whatever else. But nonetheless, these are important questions to have, and I think there's a risk in politics that you get a little bit complacent on these institutions of government or other political systems have had stuff like this before, and things don't get questioned, and the person who asks the awkward questions receives more criticism than the questions that they're putting, and that would be my fear. And I know there probably is probably a fair point that maybe was a bit hyperbolic. Perhaps I was very frustrated with the letter. I thought the letter, and I thought a number of other things that have happened over the last few years have built up together to warrant a very fair question to the president that hasn't been answered. And I think eventually that question should be answered. And if it isn't, I just fear for where we might go.
Yeah, I think you're dead right, and I think you make a lot of points similar to kind of what myself and Eric said in the last episode, and I did maybe misinterpret your tweet. Sorry for kind of making you sound like a kind of a hawk asking for the Irish president to resign. But no, I fully agree. And look, we kind of said it the last episode as well, and now it even raises those interesting questions about the office of the Irish presidency, and whether that needs to be reevaluated in light of this presidency, which has been quite unique, I think, compared to other presidencies. And that's something we could definitely talk on in a future episode, because I think the next presidential election will be a fascinating one, like all presidential elections in this country. But Art, we've come to the end of the road now, and we have our last question to you, which is the kind of the nice one we ask all of the guests we bring on, and that's about your future. And my question to you is, do you have future aspirations? And if so, what would your ideal position be? If you could bring in one policy, what would it be? What ministry would you take? This is dream-like questions, and it's okay to say you don't want to get involved in politics, but we'll see how you take the question.
Well, Luke, you described it as dream-like. I'm sure there's probably a lot of people listening who think it's probably nightmare-like, the idea of Arthur Mahoney being in cabinet. But if I'm being honest, for most of my time in youth politics, I was convinced I was going to be a politician. One of these people running around thinking they're a young politician. I can say with a degree of certainty, I won't be running in the next local elections. Maybe the following one, possibly, if depending on where I am in life. But in terms of my contribution to political discourse and to organized politics, I'm really happy to be an assistant on the sidelines at the moment and helping other people who I believe are going to be amazing in their own right. If I did end up in politics, and if I did end up being in a position to influence things immeasurably, this is probably not the answer you expect, but if I was to pick a department, I would love to be the Minister for Health. And the reason I would love to be the Minister for Health is that I think that I find it more frustrating than anything else, our lack of progress when it comes to the implementation of sláinte care and the support for Ireland's care system. Now, I don't want to open up an entirely new conversation, but I firmly think that our biggest failing as a government and successive governments has been our failure to actually develop a healthcare system that is good at preventative measures, that is good at preventing people from arriving in hospital. I think we've really undervalued family carers, undervalued people who work in the community, undervalued therapists, and undervalued people who work in the Irish healthcare system to effectively ensure that people can grow old with dignity and respect, that people with disabilities can be enabled to live properly in their community. And I think we spend so much and misspend so much in health that it's an area that frustrates me more than most. And I probably would be amazingly unpopular by as every Minister for Health is, in trying to resolve these issues. But if I did appear in politics at some point, and I would have no intention of ever being a career politician or ever deciding that that's the end game for me, but I would love to do something meaningful for people who are looking after others, because I think they're probably the most forgotten aspect of our society and the most important as well. And yeah, God help me in the process of trying to sort out Ireland's healthcare system. But yeah, that would be it, Luke. But you never know. I could also be drinking a martini in Australia in 10 years' time, and happy to be out of the Irish political scene as well. So,
but I think you certainly deserve a rhetorical round of applause for your willingness to take on the poison chalice in politics. Everyone seems to want to run away from. I think the gallantry is certainly appreciated on my part and Luke's. But thank you so much, Art, for joining us in this episode. It's been a pleasure having you on, as you said initially, and we had a fantastic conversation. Certainly gave Luke and I lots of food for thought, and I'm sure many of our listeners food for thought also with regards to the points that we raised, but also the wider question about young people's capacity to contribute to political discourse, which is what we try to do with this podcast, and actually engage and participate in politics too. As we always say at the end of the episode, please give us a very high rating if you're watching us listening to us on a good podcasting platform. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, comment your thoughts in the bottom if you have any, and follow the Political Incorrectors on the social media accounts of ours. Art, would you like to share your Twitter, Instagram, other social media tags and where people can find you and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could be wrong, but I think my Twitter username is @ArtO'Mahony, and my organization is a lot more simple than mine. It's @YFG. And if anybody has taken inspiration over the course of the last hour of my ramblings, you can certainly you can get involved by joining us at yfg.ie. And if you feel the need to follow me on any other means of social media, that's grand as well. But I'm not as politically active on those.
Fantastic. So we will be back with another episode very, very soon. Thank you so much for listening once more, and bye.
Sloan.